This is,
I'm
I'm hearing an echo in my ear. Are we good? Are we good? Okay, this is meeting number 8 of the Common Standing Committee. When we initially set this meeting up, we thought it was going to be an in-person meeting. Fortunately, on Monday, we were able to change that to be a virtual meeting, and anticipate for the foreseeable future, the Public Safety Committee will be having virtual meetings rather than in-person meetings. And so I'd ask for a little forgiveness and understanding among colleagues today, and those who are witnesses and those who are watching, that we may have a few glitches. Probably the major source of glitches will be the chair. So when you're as you're speaking, if you plan to use an alternate language, you'll notice that there's an icon at the bottom of the screen, English, French, and back and forth. If you decide to switch languages, just pause for a second. Please wait until I recognize you by name, and then you can click on your microphone. I've already established that I can't cut off your microphone, which is really quite regrettable as far as I'm concerned. A reminder that all commentary should be addressed through the chair. And I just say to the witnesses, if you just kind of keep an eye on the chair, I'll try to signal when your time is up. I don't wish to interrupt you, but I'm going to be, as I said earlier, the tyranny of the time is really quite regrettable. When you're not speaking, mute your mic. And we're obviously encouraging use of headsets, and it looks like most everybody has got a headset. So to begin, we have 3 witnesses, the Assembly of First Nations, and who's speaking on behalf of the Assembly of First Nations. I see my colleague Jack has a motion, which we did discuss earlier, and I'm looking for Jack to read that motion quickly and to look for immediate consensus on that motion.
Yes, Chair, thank you. I think you will find it that there is a consensus to support this motion. Reads as follows, and I think it's been circulated in both languages, that in relation to the committee's study of systemic racism in policing services in Canada, and notwithstanding the motion adopted on February the 20th, 2020 concerning the questioning of witnesses, for the remainder of this study, the rotation for questions be conducted as follows. Round 1, 6 minutes per party in the usual order, Conservative, Liberal, Bloc Québécois, and NDP, for a total of 24 minutes, followed by round 2, 3 minutes each for the Conservatives, Liberals, Conservative Liberals, and 1.5 minutes each for the Bloc and the NDP, for a total of 15 minutes and a grand total of 60 minutes, 21 minutes having been allocated for opening statements by the witnesses. Thank you.
Motion's on the floor. Any discussion? Seeing none.
Those in favor?
Those in favor?
Aye.
Okay.
Okay.
And motion's
The motion's adopted. Thank you.
Clerk,
and I'm still hearing.
Does the clerk have to do that formally, or can we just raise our hands like we just did?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, we're supposed to do all votes by recorded
roll
votes.
call.
Record. We have to record every vote?
Yes.
Okay, I'll let you know.
I'll try to do that quickly.
Okay.
Damoff?
Yes.
Mr. Ananda Sangari?
He's on mute.
I saw him raise his hand.
Yeah.
Mr. Fergus?
Yes.
Mr. Sikan?
Hey. Yes.
Ms. Kara?
Yes.
Mr. Berthaud?
Oui.
Mr. Morrison?
Yes.
Mr. Vidal?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Madame Michaud?
Oui.
Okay.
So the motion is adopted.
Motion adopted. Thank you. So I see that we are running 10 minutes past the hour already. So I'm just giving notice to the folks that run these meetings that we will be running 10 minutes past 12 o'clock. So our first witness is from the Assembly of First Nations. It is Regional Chief Terry Teegee. I see him on the line. Representing ITK, we have Nathan Obed. president, as well as Aluki Koterik from the Nunavut Tungavik. Chief Tiji, you have the floor for 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Just want to acknowledge the territory that I'm on right now in Shuswap territory in British Columbia. Seeing that I only have 7 minutes, I just want to thank everybody for this very important matter in terms of policing. And, I think during this pandemic, since March, we've seen a lot of situations where many First Nations have been adversely affected by policing, whether it was the 3 in Winnipeg or Chantal Moore on a wellness check in New Brunswick, or Mr. Levi in New Brunswick as well. And I myself have a family member, Everett Riley Patrick, who died in custody in Prince George, British Columbia. So going forward, I do have a presentation, and it was quite lengthy, and it really talked about the history of policing in British, or not only in British Columbia, but I suppose Canada itself. So I just want to move right to the recommendations that were really, I think, are quite important, and I do have 14 recommendations that came from our organizations. And I just want to note too that as the regional chief of British Columbia, I hold this file for justice, as well as Jocelyn Picard he's the regional chief of Quebec and Labrador. So the first recommendation is really accelerating federal action on the calls to justice for the national inquiry into Indigenous murders, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And recently, the federal government finalized a report last year and promised an action plan within a year, and that year has passed. And right now, we really need those calls to justice implemented, the well over 231 recommendations. The other recommendation, number 2, is working with First Nations on a legislative framework to support First Nations-led policing with proper financial resources to support self-determining efforts of First Nations policing services. Recently, we heard from the federal government that there is a promise from going from program funding to essential services funding, but it has to be much more than that, and more so for First Nations that are asserting their sovereignty and their self-determination in terms of policing. And there's tripartite agreements with many First Nations, and also with First Nations that do have treaties, and those need to be finalized in terms of making it clear and regarding how those laws are implemented. And really, I think creating a better relationship with federal and provincial governments is required. Recommendation 3, federal and provincial support for First Nations, restorative justice initiatives, and respect for the jurisdiction that arises from such initiatives. Prior to colonizations, many First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples had their own model of policing, had our own laws, and asserted their laws, and those laws need to be upheld. Recommendation 4, immediately establish an independent review of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, operational practices involving wellness checks, which provides recommendations for reforms. As expounded in point 5, police are ill-equipped to deal with sensitive situations involving wellness checks. An independent review is needed to make recommendations on how other services like mental health support, homelessness, other social work services can be addressed without the police, and more importantly, in terms of mental health, is really required there. redirecting fiscal resource for militarized policing to much needed, more effective social supports, such as mental health support, homelessness support, and social work supports that do not require police presence. Recommendation number 6, implementation of zero tolerance policies on the use of excessive force. Recommendation 7, a review of the RCMP Act, including providing more power to a civilian oversight body and to provide provisions that clearly state First Nations jurisdiction in matters of policing. Recommendation 8, develop legislation that outlaws white supremacist ideologies while simultaneously increasing the role of the Canadian Human Rights Commission to deal with the private matters involving racist hate speech in action. Recommendation 8 and 9, greater accountability for the protection or respect of the fundamental human rights of First Nations, including the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Increase of, recommendation 10, increase use of police body cameras in First Nations communities and access to video records. Recommendation 11, enhance de-escalation and implicit bias training, including cross-cultural training. Number 12, recruitment and promotion of First Nations within the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Recommendation 13, change name of Canada's National Police Force to Police Service. It's not a force, it should be a service. To signal the rest of Canada that violence towards First Nations and other racialized groups is no longer tolerated. And recommendation 14, create a national First Nations justice strategic framework, action plan, and commitments led by First Nations with full support and partnership of Canada and the provinces. For British Columbia, we do have a British Columbia First Nations justice strategy, which involves not only justice within the province of British Columbia, but nationally. And I believe we're the only province and region that does have a strategic plan, thanks to our chair, Doug White, who's on this call right now, and our BC First Nations Justice Council for developing that plan. And we need more like that. Currently, we are working on a proposal to the federal government, and certainly we do need support from other regions, and we're out there soliciting to other regions and other provinces, First Nations, on what they would see strategically in a national justice strategy. And I think that really involves policing. For many years, since colonization began, the police force was used to take our people off the land. More recently, at the advent of the residential school policies, many of our children were taken from our homes and brought to residential schools. And in my language, the carrier language, we call the RCMP Nulchuckin. And Nulchuckin, interpreted in our language, is those who take us away. And really, it was the people, the RCMP, that took our children away. And that's, in many respects, that's the way we still see the RCMP, because as we've seen even during this pandemic, the many instances, the excessive use of force on our Indigenous people across this country, there definitely needs to be change, systemic change, really going from very punitive policies towards Indigenous peoples and racialized our minorities in Canada, and more to here what we're looking at is more restorative justice and really a call to looking towards rehabilitation and towards alternatives to to jails. Canada and British Columbia, many First Nations, we lead statistically in terms of incarceration rates, and also in terms of those who have died during in custody. And right now, policing is seen as more of a program fund. And although Minister Blair has promised us right now that it would become more of an essential services funding, that is a positive move, but I think it needs to be more than that. And you know, it's definitely hear from other Indigenous leaders on this presentation calling for the same thing. And we definitely need change in policing in this country that we call Canada. So with that, I'd just like to thank you all for listening to my presentation today, and look forward to the other presenters today here today. And just want to say, Masi Cho, thank you very much.
Chair, you're on mute there.
Somebody inadvertently muted me during the meeting. Thank you, Chief TG. Our next presenter is Nathan Obed, as well as Aluki Koterik. You have 10 minutes. I inadvertently said to Chief TG that he had 7 minutes. Actually, national groups have 10 minutes. But I did, Chief TG, you got your full 10 minutes regardless. So with that, who is speaking first?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start.
Okay.
It's great to see everyone. Good morning. I'll get right into it, and I'll be sharing my time with President Kuta. Inuit Nunagat is the homeland where Inuit encompasses 51 communities spanning 4 regions in the Northwest Territories: Nunavut, Nunavik, and Nunatsiavut. We, as Inuit, disproportionately experience police violence compared to most other Canadians, as well as a host of challenges to accessing justice. Police violence isn't just an issue unto itself, and it is part of a larger systemic issue in relation to social inequity. Things such as housing and mental health care, access to education, employment, poverty, all of these things have to be discussed in relation to police violence as well. We can see police violence through the high rate of police-related deaths in our communities in comparison to other regions of Canada. Although aggregated data is not available for all 4 Inuit regions, and also not available for Inuit living outside of Inuit Nunagat, what we know paints a distressing picture of the systemic nature of police violence and discrimination against many of our communities. With 16 police-related deaths in the last 20 years, Nunavut's overall per capita rate of police-related deaths since 1999 is more than 9 times higher than Ontario's, and about 3 times higher than both Yukon and the Northwest Territories. The situation in Nunavik is also grim. Between July 2014 and October 2018 alone, 8 Inuit were killed and at least 4 injured by the Kativik Regional Police Force. Between 2016 and 2018, the KRPF were involved in about 10% of all cases of police-related deaths or injuries in the province, or 55 times that of the Montreal Police Force. The situation for Inuit in the Northwest Territories and Nunatsiavut, as well as for Inuit living outside of Inuit Nunagat, is less clear. But what is clear is that systemic racism and racism itself kills. And the police force is largely itinerant, don't have clear connection to community, and there are very few police officers that are Inuit. This leads to the types of staggering figures that I've just discussed with you. Action is required to curb these disturbing trends, and these actions should include a systematic independent review of the policing practices of the RCMP and the KRPF. And in consideration of that action, Inuit participation and construction of the governance of that review should be first and foremost. We are tired of being left on the sidelines. when there are reviews, because in the end, our views and our perspectives are always at risk of being drowned out by other considerations. Body cameras and other measures should be taken to enhance transparency and accountability within law enforcement. Greater recruitment and retention of Inuit and Inuktitut speakers in law enforcement is necessary to build trust and improve communication between Inuit and law enforcement. And aggregated Inuit-specific data from across Inuit Nunangat, as well as outside of Inuit Nunangat, is required to more fully understand and address police-related violence against Inuit. I'll hand the rest of the time over to President Gupta.
An imbalance of power and control has characterized the relationship between RCMP and Nunavut Inuit since the relationship began. This is well documented through the Qikiqtani Truth Commission, which describes the relationship between the years 1940 and 1975. RCMP came to our homelands as agents of federal government, not only as agents of change, agents of colonialism, but also with the self-interested view of a country that needed to assert Arctic sovereignty. There's no doubt that the relationship between Nunavut Inuit and the RCMP is complex and strained. RCMP were instrumental in relocating Inuit families into communities. RCMP were instrumental in sending Inuit children to residential schools. RCMP were instrumental in dog slaughters of Inuit sled dogs. In a quote by John Amawalik in speaking about how his family was moved from Inukjuak in northern Quebec, Nunavik, to the high Arctic in Nunavut, I quote, "I think it is important for people to understand that when the RCMP made a request to you in those days, it was seen as something like an order. You are ordered to do this. The RCMP officers had a lot of power. They could put you in jail. That's the way they were viewed in those days. A request from the police was taken very, very seriously. Today, many of the social and economic challenges experienced by Inuit are rooted in the loss of power and control caused by much of the colonial relationship. Due to the scarcity of mental health services and supports, the RCMP is often the first stop for Nunavut Inuit to get access to care. Yet, care is often not received. Instead, Inuit are targets of excessive force in interactions with the RCMP. As Natan pointed out, since 1999, there have been at least 15 deaths in Nunavut at the hands of the RCMP. The RCMP force does not understand our culture, nor does it understand our language, as demonstrated by the ratio of Inuit to non-Inuit officers in Nunavut. There is no wonder that there is a relationship of distrust between Nunavut Inuit and the RCMP. If, in fact, the purpose of the RCMP is to serve and protect, the onus and responsibility is on the RCMP to build up the trust in our Inuit communities. There needs to be a trauma-informed approach that recognizes that in very recent history, Inuit have experienced a shift in power and authority, and that there are reasons why there are social ills in our communities. There needs to be an independent oversight model that monitors the behavior of the RCMP and its interaction with Inuit. There needs to be more Inuit RCMP officers. There needs to be better cultural training for RCMP officers that will be working in our Inuit communities. In order to nurture and strengthen community trust or community relationship, RCMP officers need to stay longer in our communities so that they become part of our communities. Thank you.
Thank you. You still have 2 minutes left if there's anything else that needs to be said by either you or Mr. Obed.
I'm fine with going into the questions.
Okay. Well, with that, we will go into the questions. Our first 6 minutes goes to Mr. Vidal. After that, Madame Cara. After that, Madame Michaud. And after that, Madame Quakek. So we are now into the first 6 minutes. Mr. Vidal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to join your committee today, and I thank my colleagues for allowing me to be here. I also want to thank the witnesses. It's great to have you here and great to hear your testimony and input into this very important matter. I heard much from each of you about the importance of relationships. A number of the witnesses, or a couple of you at least, talked about service rather than force and some of that kind of language, and I appreciate that. As the former mayor of a small city in Saskatchewan, we had a very unique policing situation in that we shared a detachment with not only our little city, but the surrounding rural municipality and 2 First Nation communities that we shared our police service with. There was a very obvious correlation between the relationship or the rapport that our community partners had with our commanding officer and how that affected the overall relationship of the service. One of the highlights that we had in our little community and on our community's relationship with the RCMP was one time we asked them in their annual performance planning cycle to place a priority on promoting relationship and promoting the good things they do. And we found that to be very effective, both for the community partners, both of the city, the rural municipality, and the First Nations communities, as well as the RCMP, as it turned into a positive exercise in building relationships. So I guess my question for each of you, I'd like to give you all an opportunity to speak to this if you could. Would you offer or could you discuss any kind of best practices or any of experiences that you've had in your past relationship with the RCMP that could be a lesson for all of us across the country to use in improving that relationship and that spirit of service rather than force?
Are you directing that to Chief TG first, or to
Chief TG and President Obed? I would like that opportunity to have all of them to answer that if we could.
Okay, and I just remind witnesses if they direct their remarks through the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that question, Mr. Vidal. I think, for myself, the experiences, the example that you gave for a small community is a perfect example of how the RCMP need to relate to really the governance. And, for my First Nations community, I'm from Tackle Lake First Nations, and we have 3 police officers up in our territory, and there is, for the most part, a good relationship with our chief and council and our community, including adopting some of those police officers into our potlatch system and adopting them into the Caribou clan, some of them. But and the other example I have is in the Prince George area, where we've created a good relationship with the high-level superintendents, and it really began with Brenda Butterworth's Carr, who was a First Nations woman of First Nations descent, and she'd worked in Ottawa for a while, and now she works for the provincial government in policing. Mm-hmm. But the superintendents now I still have a good relationship with. But, even though on a very high level we have good relationships with many political higher level people, it doesn't translate to those that are on the beat, those police officers. There is still high level of incarceration death rates in Prince George, going back to Clayton Wiley, 2017, Wet'suwet'en Mandale Culver, and more recently my cousin, Everett Riley Patrick, in April. So we could have as great a relationship on the very highest level, but if it isn't translating down to the police officers, it's not going to create the change that we need. And more often than not, we're seeing death in large municipalities like Winnipeg. We have, many other reports, like the Frank Paul inquiry in Vancouver, and the Oka crisis in that municipality. The use of force by many of those police officers, and then militarized, brought in the Oka crisis 30 years ago. So as you can tell, we can have great relationships on a high level, but if it doesn't translate and those relationships aren't translated down to that level, then we're going to have a really tough time. Thank you.
You have roughly a minute left.
President Obed, possibly?
Thank you. Just in my personal work experience, I was involved when I was an employee of Nunavut Tungavik to work on the creation of the Nunavut suicide prevention strategy. And at that time, the commander of the V Division, Steve McVarnick, sat in and participated and also had the RCMP as a partner in the creation of the Nunavut suicide prevention strategy. And so it was one of the few times that I've had positive experiences with the RCMP as an institution. And it was remarkable to me how different that relationship was in relation to most other interactions. I also want to just highlight the reports of the Anishinaabe Asti Police Force and the stark contrast of their record serving First Nations people in Ontario, in their own community, from the results and the stats that we have here today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vidal, Mr. Obed. Our next 6 minutes is Madame Cara.
Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you everyone for joining us and for your testimonies. Perhaps I'll start with TG. I was reading one of your interviews, and you've stated rightfully so, and I think you said that if it was up to you, there needs to be an overhaul, a systemic overhaul of the policing system, whether it is the RCMP or municipal police. And I agree. I think the numbers, the stories, and your testimony speak for themselves, whether it is the incarceration of Indigenous, Black, and racialized Canadians in prison, or the use of force, including fatal force within policing. And that's exactly the issues that we're looking at as we navigate this study. From your view, what issues do you see the most pressing in addressing systemic racism, and what specific measures need to be taken? And perhaps if you can elaborate on what should be the first thing that needs to be addressed and prioritized. So I'll look to you, Chief TG, and then I'll perhaps get the others to also comment briefly. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for that. I think, at this moment, at this time, I think what we really need to change in terms of the overhaul for policing is in municipalities, large municipalities, is the help that many of the social organizations need. Good example is, if you look at Winnipeg, it's a poor side of town. It's at Vancouver, it's a downtown east side. Many of those places need the social help for homelessness, need the help for addictions and mental health. And in terms of policing, many police forces, whether it's municipal or the RCMP, are not trained to deal with those situations and not trained to do wellness checks. And I think right now, when we're talking about an overhaul of the policing system, there certainly needs to change in terms of that relationship with First Nations people and systemic change where there's really recognition of not only the laws of colonial Canada, but the laws of Indigenous peoples and the laws of our people need to be upheld. And really the implementation of the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People needs to be within policies such as the RCMP Act or the Police Act. So really I think that can be changed right away. The minimum sentencing can be changed by Minister Lametti, and I think those things can be changed, right now. But systemic change and the overhaul, I think perhaps that's going to be a long journey. Certainly looking at other organizations and other First Nations, Inuit and Métis for their inclusion and their views on that as well. So thank you.
Thank you. President Obed, would you like to comment?
Yes, just very quickly. I think what we're seeing is policing through stereotypes. And without a relationship between the RCMP and the community, Inuit aren't seen as people, but we're seen through all the negative lenses that perhaps general Canadian society thinks of when they think of Inuit and what it's like to police Inuit. But really, the RCMP are there to work with the community on a shared set of order and control that is something that is a part of our society, not necessarily a part of the RCMP doing something or not doing something. So what we see is the outcome, which is over-policing and under-policing, excessive force being used. But then also, when murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls issues are handled with the RCMP, we see complete under-policing when it comes to ensuring that Inuit women are kept safe, and that the files then, once they are opened, are handled appropriately over time. These things happen because we just don't have a relationship, and we don't also have Inuit-specific control over policing in our communities. Those are the things that need to change.
You have approximately a minute left.
Thank you. My next question is actually for Ms. Kotiak. You've also mentioned, I believe in an interview in the past, and not in the past perhaps, but I think just recently that leaders in Nunavut have requested that a civilian review and complaints commission for the RCMP conduct a full systemic review of policing in the territory after, I believe it was 30 cases that have been emerged involving allegation of police brutality and misconduct. And I know these allegations are coming from Inuit women who have complained about the RCMP response to domestic violence and sexual assault calls, as well as the treatment in jail cells. Can you tell us briefly about the situation and perhaps update us on the status of the request and the review?
That's a very important question. Regrettably, she's left you about 15 seconds to answer, but if you could take a stab at it, please.
Very briefly, I will just comment that the government of Nunavut has indicated that they are looking at an oversight model, which is encouraging. As well, not so encouraging, the Minister of Justice for the government of Nunavut has indicated that there isn't systemic racism in Nunavut, and I disagree with that. So it's very interesting to see the mixed messages coming from the government of Nunavut, and we will see what that results in.
Thank you. I'm not sure what happened there, but I appear to be staring at a blank screen. On the assumption that I'm the only one staring at a blank screen, I'm going to ask Madame Michaud for her next 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. Very much appreciated. There are some statistics that show that there are very few people who are in the police services. And one of the solutions could be that we have more Aboriginal people in the police services. Mr. Obed, you did deal with this issue somewhat. There have been some initiatives that have taken place in the RCMP. There's a recruiting program for Inuit, for high school graduates they try to encourage Inuit who are interested in enrolling in the police force. But we've heard that the communities themselves have some bias. They wonder why an Inuit would ever want to join the police force. That's some sort of a betrayal to the community because of the colonial past Is that something that you see in your communities? That is, that people are hesitant to sign up with the police force?
Thank you for the question. Just for clarity on the statistics that as we know them, as of September 2019, 3 out of 131 RCMP regular officers in Nunavut were Inuit. At the same time, only 3 officers in Nunavik out of 70 were Inuit as well. We don't have the data for the other 2 regions, which just shows you how few Inuit are in the RCMP. And as somebody who has known many friends who have thought of being RCMP officers or who were RCMP officers at one time, it's really challenging to police your own community, especially considering the foundation of the rules that are set out for you to follow. And then also the real challenges in relation to an itinerant workforce. The RCMP is structured so that people move around. And if you're somebody who is from a certain community in one of our regions, it's not a lifestyle that many Inuit want to pursue, especially if they want to stay in their community. So there are a number of very clear barriers that are in place to ensuring that there's a larger police workforce. But absolutely, it is very challenging for an Inuk to be an RCMP officer in our home communities or across Inuit Nunangat. There's a lot of challenges to that, and I'm very sympathetic to those who are trying and who have succeeded to be RCMP officers serving their people.
Merci. Je comprends qu'il y a beaucoup de barrières, justement. Qu'est-ce qui pourrait être fait pour faciliter la chose, pour inciter les gens à s'enrôler? Parce que je pense que ça pourrait être une solution. On parle d'un manque de confiance entre les communautés et entre les agents de la GRC. Alors, qu'est-ce qui pourrait être fait concrètement pour faciliter la chose?
I apologize if that was a follow-up question to me directly. I didn't hear the interpretation of that.
Yeah, I think you're correct. I didn't hear the interpretation as well. Madame Michaud, could you...
I'm on the French channel. Is it working? You mentioned that there were a lot of barriers that prevented people from enrolling in the police force. You talked about a lack of confidence in the communities towards the RCMP. So what could we do in concrete terms to remove these barriers to make the whole process easier?
Referring back to the first recommendation that I put forward, a thorough review, an independent review, and also a review that holds Inuit governance and Inuit Central to policing in Inuit Nunangat would be a great place to start. And then there could be an explicit consideration of the human resources aspect part of this, but also of the fundamental review and the relationship that we need to have. That the connection between the RCMP and the community needs to transform. And as it transforms, I think more Inuit would see a future not only just as RCMP officers, but also working in administrative jobs and other.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. You talked about officers that use body cameras. We have seen Minister Blair has decided to make these body cameras more accessible. Do you think that's a good thing? And how can we ensure that these are, in fact, accessible for your communities?
President Kutev, do you want to take this?
Madam Kertuk?
Is this for me?
Yes.
So I know in Nunavik, in northern Quebec, the police force currently uses body cams. We've been looking. It's been something that's been called for in Nunavut as something that could be used as a tool. I think it would be very helpful. I don't think it's the only way in which to make things better between the RCMP and Inuit. In fact, I just want to point out that Nunavut is quite unique in all other jurisdictions in that it's the only jurisdiction that has an Indigenous majority population that speaks a first language that is neither of the two official languages of Canada, which makes it extremely important that the police officers and the employees of this police officer are able to understand Inuit culture and able to understand Inuktitut. And I think that when the RCMP first came to our homelands, they relied heavily on special constables who were Inuit, who were able to provide not only interpretation through language, but also cultural interpretation.
We're going to have to leave Madame Michaud's question there. I just, again, encourage witnesses to occasionally look at the chair, and I'll try to give you a signal as to whether it's being wound up or not. We now move to the next 6 minutes, Madame Kakak.
Matna, thank you, Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here to share your wonderful knowledge. Shout out to the IT team and translation for always keeping us on track. I would like to point out as well, it is President Koktek and President Obed. Her title is President, just as Natanz's. So my questions are for both of them. I'm going to start with President Koktek. Do you think that the relationship between the RCMP and Inuit has ever been a good one?
I think it has always been strained.
Do you think that systemic racism is present within the RCMP?
Systemic racism is rampant in Nunavut, and it's not limited solely to the RCMP.
Thank you, Aluki, President Koktek. And can you talk to the role that the RCMP has played, maybe from a standpoint of what that profession and what that uniform can symbolize to Inuit?
Thank you. In terms of the relationship, I spoke briefly to the historical context. I think that when I look at the RCMP, I see it as just one aspect of a whole justice system. And it's not enough for us to focus solely on the RCMP. We need to look at ways in which we're addressing the social ills of our community in a holistic way, in an Inuit way. That is focused on the person and addressing the needs that they have, whether it's mental health issues. And I think that would be something that would be worth looking at. Thank you.
Thank you, President Koktek. In about a minute, can you talk a little bit to the historical aspects that you had touched on, some things that the members could expect to find in the Kahitani Truth Commission, for example?
I think it's a very complex relationship between Nunavut Inuit and the RCMP, one in which at the same time the RCMP relied heavily on Inuit because they were not able to live in our Arctic homelands, did not know what to eat, did not know how to keep warm, did not know how to transport themselves. And so Inuit were the experts in that and very helpful. But at the same time, they played a very authoritative role and were very intimidating. And so many Inuit, similar to the quote I read from John Amawalik, were intimidated and felt that they had no choice but to listen to the authority of the RCMP.
Great, Matna, President Koktek. President Obed, oftentimes Inuit aren't necessarily on national headlines, and we have been having this discussion, especially around the Black Lives Matter movement, Indigenous Lives Matter. We have been seeing those kinds of things throughout the country. Can you talk to specific examples of I'm going to use one to kick us off. We know, for example, in Kingite, we saw that video had circulated and gotten national attention. Could you give us some more recent examples of those interactions that result in death between RCMP and Inuit?
Yes. Well, very recently in Nunavut, the example of a man who was fatally shot in his home in front of his common law, and was still handcuffed after he was shot, and still not provided medical attention right away. These are the stories that we hear, where unarmed Inuit who don't have guns are being killed by our CMP officers. And sometimes these conversations come to me from friends and family. Sometimes Inuit reach out to me to talk about the things that they want to see changed. But it's great to see a national conversation happening about the things that we experience every day, especially the violence that Inuit have experienced. And of course, there needs to be a consideration of all aspects of why these things happen. But very clearly, racism kills. And the misunderstandings or the cultural differences or the lack of respect leads to this. And ultimately, I just can't accept I live in a country where a part of our government services is killing our people.
Matna, President Obed, I have about 30 seconds after I ask the next question. We talk about defunding the police, and I think that scares some people. Instead of phrasing it that way, what other services and resources should we be looking at investing in for Inuit?
We need to empower communities. We need to end systemic racism, but also that starts with social inequity. We need to ensure that we have relationships within our communities which uphold our traditions, our laws, the way that we interact within our society. And that is the first place we need to start.
This mute unmute thing is going to drive me crazy in the next 2 days. Thank you very much. And we're going to go to the 3-minute round. The first is Mr. Bitold.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. 3 minutes goes by fast, so I'll be quick. My question is for Chief Tigiji. Could you talk about the retention rates? Do you have any statistics showing how long RCMP officers remain in your communities? I think that must have an impact on the community. Do you have any statistics about the amount of time that officers spend in your communities?
No, I don't have any of those statistics about how long. But just an example for my First Nations community, it's really police officers that are newly trained. They're required, I believe, for 2 years. Some stay longer because they appreciate the community. So, but I don't have the stats on that. Sorry.
President Obed, do you have any statistics from your community?
Aside from the statistics that I presented around examples of police violence, I would have to get back to the committee. The statistics that we do have about retention and the length of stay for RCMP officers. I'm sure that information is available, and I pledge to follow up with the committee to get you that.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Chef TG, according to Professor Lebrec, the RCMP commissioner, Madame Lucky, has over 100 complaints about that need to be processed with respect to violence in your communities. What do you have to say about these complaints that have been left pending?
Well, I think, these complaints need to be addressed, and I'm sure it's much more than that, because quite frankly, I know there's complaints throughout this country, and I really think it speaks to, the racism that exists within the policing, and also this country, just in general. We've seen in many organizations here in British Columbia, it's within the health system, and that's really something that needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Mr. Rizzo. You only have about 20 seconds left. With that, we'll go to...
Monsieur Obed, est-ce que vous aussi, vous trouvez...
Mr. Obed, do you think that we should be taking action much quicker?
I'm sure that Mr. Obed does think that we should be taking action much more quickly, but he's not unfortunately going to be able to answer that question, but I'm sure he'll be able to work it into some other answer. With that, we go to Mr. Anand-Sangri. 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This question's for all three, because all three have spoken about the need for self-determination in policing. I believe Chief Tighe was talking about basically self-determination as part of First Nations-led policing, and President Obed spoke about RCMP need for Inuit-specific control. So can you maybe just elaborate on what that means to both of you? I know time is very limited, so maybe within a minute each.
I think within the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, I think, the goal is to really assert our First Nations rights, our sovereignty and self-determination in terms of our view of what I suppose the colonial word is policing. But I think it's more towards, for First Nations, it's, upholding our what we see as laws from the big house or from the potlatch house. Thank you.
President Obed?
Thank you for the question. In each of the 4 Inuit regions, there will be different ways to or paths forward in self-determination and policing. Some of our land claim agreements have self-government appendages that allow for Inuit to take down policing and provide policing directly, and some don't. But definitely we need to have the right to have these conversations and the ability to be at the table. And we'll get away from the RCMP must do this, the RCMP must do that, Canada must do this, and get towards the place where our rights are upheld. And also our self-determination leads when it comes to policing.
I believe that's my time.
You still got 45 seconds left.
So I'm just wondering, Ms. Kuturak, President Kuturak, are you able to comment on this as well?
Similar to what I said in terms of the 25 communities in Nunavut, I think there's an opportunity to have the force work with our communities and have people employed, whether they're officers or not, but similar to the way in which we had special constables. I think that would help enrich the relationship between Nunavut Inuit and the RCMP and would garner more trust between Nunavut Inuit and the RCMP.
Thank you, Mr. Anand-Sangri. Mr. Uppal, 3 minutes, please. Mr. Uppal?
Yes, hi, thank you. Had a little technical difficulties. I was just really what can we do more to attract more Indigenous communities to the police forces themselves, whether it's self-determined police forces or like to the RCMP?
Perhaps I'll start. As the RCMP is an extension of the federal government, and all of the different human resources requirements and the training, in many cases, become barriers for Inuit to become RCMP officers or to work within the RCMP administrative structures itself. Our language, Inuktitut, is not valued within any of the human resource skill sets that are required or valued within the RCMP. And then also our skill sets beyond language and our closeness to our communities have really no bearing on any of the training or the recruitment or retention or the ability to succeed as an officer, other than in the stark day-to-day realities of an Inuk being an RCMP officer in an Inuit community. It matters, but it doesn't necessarily matter in any human resource context. And that needs to change. We need to reform the way in which we think about those people who are suitable to be RCMP officers in our communities.
I think overall we need our own police forces. Just in general, there's one that exists here in British Columbia, and there are many others in Ontario and other provinces. But involvement and retention within the RCMP, I think, there's a pending class action lawsuit in regards to racist and sexist acts, and in terms of the treatment of not only Indigenous women but just Indigenous people. And I think that really indicative of the organization itself. So I think in terms of retention, it definitely needs to change and deal with the racism that exists in the RCMP, and also too that more often than not, there's also the ability for First Nations to get through testing and just get involved within the RCMP. Is there's always barriers, and that's really why I see there's sometimes some struggle to get First Nations in the RCMP.
Thank you, Mr. Uppal. Madame Damop, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. And I want to acknowledge that I am on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people today. President Obed, I first want to thank you for your always thoughtful testimony. You're very knowledgeable, but also very thoughtful in the way that you present. I'm wondering, currently we're reviewing First Nations policing, and I'm wondering your thoughts on expanding that to include Inuit, and because right now there's no agreement with Nunavut for their own police services. So rather than relying on the RCMP, you would be looking at your own police service, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I don't have any specific position as of ITK. We haven't considered the issue within our board structure. I'd like to pass it to President Kutiak for that. But I would say that, yes, absolutely, in a distinctions-based way, there needs to be a consideration of Inuit policing at the larger federal levels, and there needs to be reforms in the way in which policing happens in our communities. President Kutiak?
I think currently we know that the current way in which policing is delivered is not working. And with the excessive force and the numbers of Inuit that are dying at the hands of the RCMP is concerning. So I think any consideration that for us to look at how things can be done differently would be very useful.
And my next question is for Chief Teague. One of the concerns I have around, as we're looking at a new model, is training. And training officers in the old way is not going to present new results. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of training for First Nations policing, and whether there should be a separate Indigenous police training academy.
I don't know if it should be separate. It really depends on the situation. Perhaps separate in terms if there are training needed to go to real remote and rural areas. But I think overall what we're seeing here, incarceration deaths of First Nations and Inuit and Métis people are in urban areas. And those are the officers that really need training for mental health, addictions, and also perhaps training on an Indigenous point of view, and really have some empathy towards Indigenous people and understand our lived life and our what we've been experiencing since colonization. Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Damoff. As per the motion, there is still, and I want to beg the forgiveness of our staffing, but we're going to stretch it another 3 minutes, a minute and a half to Madame Michaud, and again a minute and a half to Madame Kakak. Madame Michaud.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Quand j'entends des témoignages comme...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When I hear about stories like the person who had handcuffs and was killed with a gun, well, clearly the RCMP is not using the normal model for intervention where the use of force must be equivalent to the resistance of the person they're dealing with. And there are reports on the use of force so there are documents filled after this type of situation, but it seems that nothing is done afterwards. So, Mr. Teague, I'd like to hear you on what should be done as a follow-up to make sure in this police services, to make sure that when there's an extreme situation like this one, it doesn't happen again. So there's a question of accountability.
I think really importantly, there definitely needs to be an independent review, a real true independent review, not necessarily police reviewing police, and a civilian review that looks at the actions of many police officers, and just in general, I suppose the training needs to be reviewed as well in terms of how they approach certain situations that involves addictions and perhaps mental health. Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Michaud. Madame Kakak.
Matna, thank you, Chair. And quick shout out to you. You've been doing really, really great with time today. I really appreciate it. For context as well for the rest of the committee, when we're talking about Nunavut, we're talking about a population just a bit bigger than Charlottetown, PEI. And I want to put that into context when we're talking about numbers especially. We know since 2010 that in Nunavut, the rate of police-related deaths is 14.35 times Ontario's. We know that suicide is 9 times the rate. We know that women in the north experience violence at 3 times the rate than the rest of Canada. My question is for President Clotek. We saw in June that this government had delayed their timeline in response to murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. What do you think that says to the relationship that the federal government has to Inuit and majority Inuit communities? And what does that say to the value that in that relationship and the value of Inuit lives?
Matna. I think it signals very publicly and gives the message that it's not a priority, despite the very public inquiry and the platitudes of how important it is and how the relationship with Indigenous peoples are more important than other relationships. I liken it to a recent document I read here in Nunavut, where similarly the RCMP are called by Inuit women because they're seeking assistance because they're in a violent situation, and the RCMP does not show up. So it feels like it's in that sort of vein, that all the information is now publicly available, and yet it's not important enough yet to action it. Thank you.
With that, we're going to have to bring this session to a close. I want to thank the members and the witnesses for their indulgence with respect to the incompetence of the chair, but my poor colleagues on the committee will be exposed to more incompetence over the course of time. President Obed, President Katerik, Chief TG, you have launched this this inquiry very well, and on behalf of the committee, I want to thank you for your efforts to be here and to articulate your views. With that, I'm told that I have to say we are suspended. Is that correct? And I'm assuming we do not leave. particular order, unless there's been some agreement that I don't know about. I'm just going to go in the order that you are listed on the witness list, and you have Senator White, 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I want to thank you for the invitation to the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security, in particular meeting on systemic racism and policing. If I may, I'll introduce myself, which will help members better focus some of their questions. I spent almost 25 years in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, working in Newfoundland and Labrador, the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Yukon, Nova Scotia, and here in Ottawa at headquarters. Of my almost 25 years, I spent 19 years in the North, spread across the 3 territories and Northern Labrador. I left the RCMP as an assistant.
What's going?
Something else started talking again.
Oh, hang on for a second.
It's replaying what I was saying.
We are having technical difficulties, as they say.
Can you hear that as well, Mr.?
I can hear you, but I don't hear any echo. You were going along perfectly well as far as I was concerned.
Yeah, it's replaying what I had already said. I'm not sure why.
I know.
Can hear it.
I can say this with some familiarity with the senator because I know he's very repetitive.
There we go. I left the RCMP as an assistant commissioner in 2005, following my time as a member of the RCMP. Following my time, okay.
Okay, we seem to be having more technical difficulties.
Tell me when to start again.
Yeah, okay. What's been the difficulty? Senator White, is your interpretation button on English?
Are we okay now?
I can hear you perfectly well, but I've been able to hear you perfectly well for the entire period of time.
Okay, how about if I go now? I'll continue on.
Are we good to go?
I'm not hearing it again.
I'm getting shrugs from the other side.
Okay, so I'll continue on.
So I think we plow on.
Okay.
And if you wish to restart, you're welcome to do so.
No, I'm okay. I can continue.
Okay, thank you.
Following my time as a member of the RCMP, I spent 7 years as a police chief, 2 years in Durham region, and then 5 years here in Ottawa. From an education perspective, I have an undergraduate degree from Acadia's University, master's from Royal Roads, and a doctorate from the Australian Graduate School of Policing at Charles Sturt University. All education was completed while continuing to work full-time in my policing roles. Following my policing career, I was appointed to the Senate, and as well have continued to teach at various universities in Canada and internationally, as well as doing research, often into the issues that impact our criminal justice system and, of course, policing itself. In relation to your work here, I wanted to speak to a few areas that I believe are important to this discussion, and they include training and recruiting, education, and, of course, the most recent argument for defunding of the police. I will as well conclude my comments with my view on systemic racism in policing. Although it is already dated, there is a 2014 Justice Gouge report, Policing Canada in the 21st Century, which I believe the committee may want to have a look at as are good avenues for discussion that you could consider. On the recruitment and training perspective, I believe we need a national review in both of these areas. I would argue that today, policing is no longer following standards that are set out nationally, but rather found within the mandate of the provinces and territories, and as a result, difficult to completely engage in. We have, give or take, 180 police agencies in Canada with expenditures in around $15 billion. And the disparity in training and recruiting is notable. I would argue that this is an area where the federal government could have set a path forward in setting national policing standards for both officers and police agencies. Having met previously with First Nations police chiefs, they expressed a similar concern and stated that they as well would support such a movement. Other countries have been able to do this by setting up a college of policing model, not to be confused with the police college. As an example, the UK has done this when they established their College of Policing, which is a professional body for everyone who works in policing in England and Wales. The purpose of the college is to, quote, provide those working in policing with the skills and knowledge necessary to prevent crime, protect the public, and secure public trust. Their functions include three primary areas: knowledge, developing research and infrastructure for improving evidence of what works; education, supporting the development of individuals in policing, including setting educational requirements; and lastly, standards, drawing on the best available evidence of what works to set standards in policing for forces and individuals. I would make that argument that a similar model would be developed in Canada. We may see some jurisdictional arguments. Maybe some jurisdictions arguing they'd like to opt out. I would suggest that that would be at their peril. We can see across this country that without this model, we're scattered from both a recruiting standards and training standards perspective. Ontario, it's 13 weeks to complete your basic training. The RCMP is 6 months. Some other jurisdictions are even longer. The stark realities, challenges police agencies have faced has changed dramatically, and I'm not sure that we've kept up. Education of police officers is essential to the development of that officer and the organization overall. Research conducted in the United Kingdom and Australia speaks to the importance of not only continuous training of police officers, but as well continuous education. I do not argue, as some may, that police officers must have a university degree to begin their career, but I am of the firm belief that education needs to be a foundation of their career and provided throughout their career. Some countries require a police officer to complete an undergraduate degree to be considered fully accredited. Some require education taken in its entirety prior to entering the police service, and others that it continues throughout their career. Regardless, I believe that a focus on education will be important as we look to move forward. The last area, defunding of police. This most recent argument is one that in a different way has been argued by police officers and police leaders for decades, except they have been arguing that the demands placed on them would often be better served by others. In 2008, when the federal government advised they would provide funds for a 2,500 officer program, many, including myself and senior union leaders, argued that the funds would be better advised to be provided for mental health and addiction services. The continued growth of expectations placed on the police has seen a concurrent growth in policing budgets at some level. As an example, the deinstitutionalization of mental health facilities in the late 80s and into the 90s saw a growth in the involvement of police officers in mental health calls for service. The provinces believed that the process of moving patients or clients into communities was better for the lives of the individuals, and it was. However, there was also substantial savings that were often not reinvested into community programming to provide support. The impact is that the police have become the de facto response unit all too often to mental health calls for service, often without the resources needed to fully engage, instead using the tools they have. Some police agencies have identified that a full 20% of their calls for service are mental health calls, often not criminal in nature. Some would argue that more mental health workers working hand in glove with the police responding to these calls would be a better service. It's been done, and it is better. However, even this response is a downstream service. The stark reality is that wait times to see much needed mental health resources in the community is shockingly insufficient, and that investment in this upstream section of the health system is where we can make the greatest impact and we reduce demand on the police. Most importantly, having the right resource engaged at the right time for the right reason. The same could be argued for the lack of drug addiction resources, where we have 6 to 8 month wait lists in many provinces for residential or even non-residential drug treatment. Many of the people on these wait lists find themselves involved in the criminal justice system, often many times while waiting for treatment. Again, funding for residential, non-residential drug treatment would remove many of the addicted from the work of our law enforcement and criminal justice systems and place it where it should be, which is with health officials.
Senator White, can you wind up? I apologize for
my last point in relation specifically to systemic racism. I would argue that in all governmental organizations, there has been and most often still is systemic racism. This includes the police. An example I've used is representation. In fact, a report from Parliamentary Committee called Equality Now and work done by the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police identified that law enforcement must be a representative institution. both identified this when the discussion of racial bias was at the forefront. Now, some would say we need time. Well, the Equality Now report and the consensus report from CECP were completed in 1983 and 1984. The question is how much time is needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our second 7-minute round is with Mr. Cohen. 7 minutes, please. You need to take your mic. That's it.
You'd think that after so many months on Zoom, I would remember that. But look, thank you for
You're not alone.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Just quickly by way of introduction, I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Legal Services Board of Nunavut, which is the territorial legal aid provider. Nunavut's legal aid context is a little different. There are very few private lawyers in Nunavut. The Legal Services Board is by far the largest employer of lawyers in Nunavut, perhaps even in the Arctic. Certainly that's the case with respect to criminal law. Almost 100% of criminal cases pass through our staff lawyers and our contract lawyers at some point, and we probably carry more than 90% of them to conclusion. So I reside in Rankin Inlet. I've been there since January 2019, which is a community of about 2,500 people in the Kivalliq region in central Nunavut, and I grew up in a series of remote First Nation communities in northern Manitoba and northern Ontario, and while I have a lot of experience working and living with Indigenous communities, I want to be really clear that my perspective is not that of an Indigenous person. And you heard I was listening in on the previous witnesses, and there, with respect to Nunavut, President Obed and President Kotkerk's evidence and perspective is, I'd submit, the lens through which these issues need to be dealt with. I can offer some technical advice, but I want to be really clear that I'm not offering. I don't experience the systemic racism in the same way that the Inuit members of my community do. And when we talk about systemic racism, for me, it's a fairly simple equation, right? Is there a racialized group that is experiencing a disproportionate burden or barrier? Is that ongoing and persistent? And are remedial efforts ineffective or non-existent? And I would submit that the evidence of that being the case with respect to policing in Nunavut is overwhelming. We can start in terms of evidence. We can look at the data from StatsCan that suggests that Nunavummiut, so are people who reside in Nunavut, who are outside of Iqaluit, in most communities, that's over 90%, are 4 times as likely to be charged with a criminal offense than other Canadians. Once charged, they're more likely to be prosecuted. Once prosecuted, they're more likely to be convicted. Once convicted, they're more likely to be sentenced to jail. They are sentenced to longer sentences, and they serve more of those sentences. I've summarized some of that data in the Legal Services Board 2018-2019 annual report. If you're interested, and there are sources for it as well. We also, when we look at the evidence of systemic racism with respect to policing in Nunavut, we can also look at the repeated instances that we hear throughout the justice system of interactions between the police and members of the community that are fraught with violence and that are otherwise problematic. I summarized almost 30 of those last June and forwarded them to the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission. I met with the commissioner and asked her to consider doing a systemic review. But those instances that I reported on are still a fraction of what we hear in the community on a regular and ongoing basis. They're present in the courts. There's a consistent process of where charges are withdrawn, or there's judicial commentary on these incidences, and And so there is a wealth of evidence that on the ground there are problematic interactions of the nature that, frankly, just don't exist to the same extent in other jurisdictions in the country. And then when we look at the other piece of evidence is sort of what's missing, which is any sort of systematic or public or transparent approach to the conduct and criminal investigations and proceedings in relation to this conduct. There have been a few conduct investigations and a few, one set of criminal charges that have been laid in Nunavut against police over the past 20 years. But generally speaking, partly because I submit that there's just very little systematic approach to conduct investigations on the part of the RCMP senior management, and partly because it's not a transparent model. We just don't see evidence of these matters being addressed. Look, very quickly, I'd say that obviously it's really clear that a new model is required for policing in Nunavut. Regardless of the content of that model, I'd say that there are three elements that must be addressed for any change to be possible. One is increased resources to frontline policing. And in this age of defund the police, I know that's not a very popular point of view, but the conditions that rank and file officers are forced to deal with are unbelievably arduous and stressful, and no change is possible without more resources. And frankly, you're never going to attract qualified Inuit applicants to go and work in those conditions either. And so without increased funding for frontline policing, no change is possible. Secondly, you need increased resources for restorative justice and social services in the communities. I cannot emphasize enough that the lack of alternative dispute resolution or counseling or therapeutic services in Nunavut communities. There is basically a dearth of any of the range of services that are provided in other communities in this country. So as a result, all these problems are handed to the police, and they respond with the tools that they have, which more often are not are the tools of coercion, arrest, and charging. The third thing that has to change is that there needs to be a meaningful, robust, independent civilian oversight, and that means independent and civilian investigations on criminal and use of force and death allegations, independent complaint-based conduct investigations, and independent oversight at the national level of RCMP policy and strategic direction. And that I think it's clear that the senior management of the RCMP are unable to drive change and respond to this. And the current situation where they're responsible for, where they're not accountable to civilian oversight in a structured way is part of the problem.
Thank you, Mr. Cowan. With that, I'm going to ask Mr. Wright as our final 7-minute witness, please. You'll have to take yourself off mute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. By way of introduction, let me just say that I'm Robert Wright. I'm a social worker and a sociologist whose 30-year career in the field has brought me into the fields of child welfare, correctional mental health, education, and a range of other places. And I've worked extensively with victims and perpetrators of violence and of all forms. I think that, so I want to thank the committee for having me as a witness, and I hope I can bring an informed perspective to the committee. I hail from Nova Scotia, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq peoples, and people of African descent were not so much settlers as they were settled on this territory, and we have been here for over 400 years and have still some of the oldest and largest Black communities of Canada here in Nova Scotia. when it comes to thinking about systemic racism in policing, we have the distinction in Nova Scotia of having been the province of the inquiry into the wrongful conviction of the Donald Marshall Jr. And we're also the province of the Supreme Court decision in the case known as RDS. And as the pioneer of impact of race and culture assessments, I am proud that Nova Scotia is the first jurisdiction in Canada to use these specialized pre-sentence reports to support the courts arriving at more informed sentences in an effort to address, in part, the dramatic overrepresentation of people of African descent under correctional supervision in Canada. I was a participant in a dialogue between members of African Canadian communities and the Canadian Human Rights Commission several years ago. The Office of the Correctional Investigator had representatives at that meeting, and it was their presence at those meetings that prompted the OCI to make a focal point of their 2013 report, a focus on diversity in corrections and the experiences of Black inmates under correctional supervision. I do not believe I need to tell the members of this committee or Canadians viewing this proceeding that racism exists in the criminal justice system and that policing, as the doorway into that system, is a critical location to address issues of systemic racism, overrepresentation, and differential treatment of people of African descent within those systems. In response to your questions later, no doubt I will reference recommendations that have been articulated in other reports and studies. But I want to use my time now to emphasize 2 or 3 points here that I think are critical as we consider how to address the systemic racism that exists in policing and in other layers of the criminal justice system. The first point is that any reform, any study, any solution must be led by people of African descent. In response to the challenges that we have had here recently in Nova Scotia related to police street checks, and I won't speak in great detail about the machinations that that accompanied focus on the dramatic overrepresentation of Black bodies in those statistics. But I will say just that in response to the street checks issues, members of the African Nova Scotian communities here have called for a provincial African Nova Scotian policing strategy. It is our belief that no internal studies, no provincially led studies that do not focus and prioritize the leadership and the engagement of people of African descent will be sufficient to address the problem. The second thing that I would point out is that in the effort to solve the problems that exist in policing, to defund the police by shifting resources to community agencies, mental health services, and the like that might be better able to serve our populations, we must remember that those organizations to which we would shift those funds all themselves have records of systemic racism against people of African descent. And it would likely occur that simply the location of our systemic oppression and exclusion would be shifted rather than the systemic racism problem be solved. And so finally, I would simply say that in our effort to address systemic racism in policing, it will be important that all of those organizations that have oversight over policing from the human rights commissions to police review boards to police commissions and the like, that the efforts to bring systemic racism to an end in all of those locations will be essential on this work. Thank you for the time, and I look forward to engaging in the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Wright and Mr. Cowan, Senator White. With that, we start our 6-minute round with Mr. Berthold. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup.
6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator White, Mr. Wright, Mr. Cowan. Thank you for being here today with us. My first question is for Senator White. Senator, I looked at your resume and one can see that you spent a lot of time in police services in different places. A simple question first. What's the difference between being a police officer in the north and a police officer in a large city?
Based on you in northern communities, to not just be a police officer, but be a member of the recreation committee, coaching different teams, because there's an expectation placed by the community that when you come into those communities, I'll look at Kimmeroot as an example where I coached both soccer and volleyball, of which I played neither. The expectation certainly in those communities is much different. But there's also, I think, for me anyway, having served there as long as I did, 19 years, the value I felt in actually being able to help out in the community was so much more readily available. Whereas in a large city, it's often service calls, call after call, often the first few years of policing, not very engaged in community activities because you're busy doing the response type of call. The community's expectations in Nunavut, as an example, where I served my last northern time, is much different. They expect much more than just a police officer. They expect many things from you. And if you're not willing to give that, then you probably will not be very successful as a police officer in some of those communities.
Sénateur, est-ce que vous croyez qu'on a...
Senator, unfortunately, we do not have statistics because I asked the previous panel with Inuit witnesses, I asked for statistics on how long police officers stay in the north. Do you think that in 2 years a police officer has enough time to take part in the community's life in order to create links with citizens?
If you said it was, but if it was, certainly I do think 2 years is a short period of time. I think really good police officers will make themselves engaged quickly and ramp it up. The communities often identify that 2 years is not long enough. And that as well as understandable. Now, to be fair, I served 4 years in Whitehorse and 3.5 in Yellowknife, but the other communities I served in were typically 2-year times. And it was certainly my loss often to be leaving as quickly as I was. But the organization, particularly in Nunavut, probably more so than in the NWT and in the Yukon, try to move people as often as they can, not always for the betterment of the community. And certainly communities would be better served with officers serving longer periods of time. But it's a real challenge finding officers to take postings, and particularly in Nunavut today, you may not have an increased number of officers willing to do such a stint if it was longer than 2 years in a community.
Senator White, d'après un mémoire...
Senator White, according to text by a professor in Nunavut, there are so few RCMP officers. Other officers are sent regularly for 6 weeks. So what should the RCMP commissioner do in the coming months to solve this problem that seems like an urgent problem?
Since when I was there in 2001, when I first returned to Nunavut, we were bringing officers in from the south. And in fact, when I was the police chief in Ottawa, I was seconding police officers to Nunavut to do short stints to help out as well. So this is not a new phenomena. The solution to, I would argue, the solution to increased time in communities in the north, as well as having the number of officers at a sustainable level, is going to be in developing a recruiting strategy in Nunavut for Nunavut. And I think we ran an Inuit recruiting pilot project in 2001 to 3, where we hired over a dozen Inuit police officers, of which 2 or 3 are presently posted on Parliament Hill, in fact. But there are lots of challenges with that, because you have a number of barriers to hire that you have to work on, and none of those are inexpensive. So I truly believe the solution or partial solution for Nunavut is going to be a recruiting strategy that looks at today, tomorrow, and in 10 years' time, the number of Inuit that you can actually bring into the organization, whether that continues to be the RCMP, or even if they went to a self-policing model in the future, you're still going to have the same challenge. And I still think that recruiting Inuit is going to be part of that solution.
You have a little less than 30 seconds.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And with translation, it'll be even less, because I must answer a question in French. Mr. White, if I understand you, these detachments these stays should be longer, so that there can be a link with the community.
It would be better, but it's more difficult to supply the resources if you extend the number of years. You're not going to have as many officers willing to take those postings to the north.
Thank you, Mr. Broteau. Mr. Broteau, you've asked that question twice now, and I think it's a very important question. And I'm just going to suggest to the analysts that they may contact with you or your office and refine that question, and maybe that research could be provided to the committee, because it is an important question that you're asking. Okay. With that, Mr. Sicken, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to welcome our panelists. I'm going to direct my first question to Mr. Cohen and Mr. Wright. So Statistics Canada has recently announced it will begin to collect data on the race of victims of crime and people accused of crime. However, it appears it will not include data related to the use of force in the incident or mental health checks unless they involve a criminal offense. So my first question is, what do you think of this development? And I'll begin with Mr. Cohen, please.
Well, look, in a Nunavut context, the collection of that data is just frankly less relevant, because the vast majority of people are Inuit, and so I as for the rest of the country, I really don't. It's not really within my brief to sort of comment more generally. I just, in the Nunavut context, we can assume almost exactly that the people who are receiving, especially outside of Iqaluit, the people who are interacting with the police or mental health on those issues are Inuit.
Do you have any suggestions as to how that data should be collected or used?
Well, so again, in the Nunavut context, I think that the data tells a very compelling story of what's going on, and I think that I guess it's great to collect data, and it's important to collect the right data, but where we have it, where the evidence is really clear, there's still a big gap in terms of how it informs policy and operational choices on the part of institutions in the justice system.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the same questions to Mr. Wright.
My view, Mr. Sikand, is that collecting race-based data is always a positive thing. I think it's really critical that we begin as a country to better understand the real experience of an increasing diversity of Canadians. I would say that in terms of the use of the data, however, that is where I would have a concern. Okay. And that if certain data is not reviewed from a critical race perspective by individuals who are informed about the nature of systemic racism, sometimes the data can actually support what I will call racist claims. So, for example, if we take a look at data and we see that in a particular area, Black people are committing more crime than white people. If we don't understand that Black people in that area are dramatically overrepresented among the poor, among those who don't experience positive engagement in education, among those who are systemically excluded from employment, for example, then the data isn't really going to help us. So I think that what's really critical if we begin collecting this data is that we have specialized individuals within Statistic Canada who can apply critical race analysis to the data so that we are not allowing the data to reinforce racist stereotypes.
You actually bring up a great point, and I'd like to follow up with you with another question. Because you've got a lot of experience through your social work, and from the part of the country that you're from, I know Halifax has a report on street checks employed by the RCMP, and they condemned the practice as targeting young Black men and creating a disproportionate and negative impact on the Black community, leading to calls for public apology. The CRCC has undertaken a review of the RCMP's policies and procedures regarding these street checks, but the report has not been released yet. Are there any law or policy reforms you think would be helpful at the national level?
Yes, I would say this, that we have been concerned about the street check issue since 2003 with the Human Rights Commission's report that acknowledged that police had been street checking a prominent Black individual here in our community. And so the Human Rights Commission said street checks need to be taken a look at. And so since 2003, police and RCMP were keeping race-based data and did nothing with that data for 14 years. We had the Wortley report. We had a judicial or a legal opinion on the legality of street checks. And when not 3 hours after the legal opinion declared that street checks were illegal, we had a provincial ministerial directive that suggested how similar checks could be done under some kind of looking into suspicious activity. We believe that the provincial ministerial directive is still directing police to engage in illegal activity in the way they police citizens. And of course, we believe that Black folk will be dramatically overrepresented in those stats. So I think some federal directive simply suggesting that police, these practices cannot break the law is necessary.
Thank you, Mr. Second. We're going to have to leave it there.
Just real quick, do you think this warrants a public apology, yes or no, sir?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. That was very, very quick of you, Mr. Second, to sneak that question in there. Madame Michaud, 6 minutes. 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais m'adresser à...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question for Mr. White first. You have a lot of experience with the RCMP and as Chief of Police. You talked about three parts: training, recruitment, and another one. According to your experience, when you were in the field, was there specific training on culture when at the beginning of police training, or for new police officers?
For the question. Certainly there was, however, I mean, my police training was with the RCMP, and we were training police officers to go everywhere and anywhere in Canada, and you found out where you were going close to the end of your career. So it was not specific to the location you were about to go to. Instead, it was generally identified as a nationally from a First Nation, Métis and Inuit, for example. I think we have seen a shift, and certainly when I was in the Yukon, when officers were coming to the Yukon, we would obligate that they be educated in the First Nation communities in the Yukon. And in fact, when they would arrive in a community, they were actually mentored by a local elder in those communities. And I think that paid dividends. The Council of Yukon First Nations was very involved in the development. And I think it paid dividends in the relationship building and the knowledge and understanding of non-Indigenous or even Indigenous officers from other parts of Canada who would come to the Yukon. I think that type of model works well. Because the RCMP training facility is so large and has so many people going through it, it's more difficult to give them the level of training they would need on every potential location they would go to. I have to say, though, I am concerned about the fact that our training is still at 6 months, or and like I said, in the province of Ontario, 13 weeks. I think a review needs to be done as to whether or not the same amount of time is needed 30 years after I went through RCMP Training Academy that was needed at that time. And I think that would be an important step forward as well.
Merci. Vous avez parlé de financement aussi. Vous pensez que des fonds devraient être redirigés ailleurs, par exemple à des organismes en santé mentale, principalement pour les communautés ou pour les agents également. Comment vous voyez ça?
Excusez-moi, Madame Michaud. No.
I'm on the French channel. I didn't get the translation earlier for Mr. White.
Michaud?
You talked about financing and rechanneling funds elsewhere, for example, to mental health organizations. How do you see this? Do you see this more for the officers or more for the people who live in the community?
Was that directed to Mr. Senator White?
Oui.
Oui.
You know, when I was the police chief in Ottawa, we had a mobile mental health crisis unit, which meant that we had mental health workers working hand in glove with police officers, supported. The concern is that it's still a downstream service, and I would argue that we would be much better off with a large infusion of funding into both mental illness and drug addiction to try and head off that problem rather than still having police officers showing up at that door. So my concern now is in the province of Nova Scotia, as example, in some locations, it's over a year wait list to see a psychiatrist today. I think we need to actually have an infusion of funds into both mental illness treatment that allows people to see it before it becomes a police phone call. And the same would go for drug addiction, where the average street addict is committing multiple crimes every day just to try and satisfy their addiction. And many of them are still waiting for months and months or longer to get into residential drug treatment. My suggestion would be the money be actually spent upstream, not downstream.
Merci, Monsieur White.
Thank you, Mr. White. Mr. Cohen, you talked about the problem of funding as well. You said that this is a divisive question. Some people talk about defunding. Some people talk about needing more resources. How do you see this issue?
Your microphone is on mute, Mr. Cowan.
I'm never going to stop. Merci pour la question.
Thank you for your question.
Again, in the Nunavut context, the question of defunding is entirely sort of just, it's a red herring. The most communities have a handful of officers who are subject to arduous conditions, and it's impossible to imagine any change, any positive change taking place unless you had more resources and more stability in community detachments. I do think alongside of that, you need a massive investment in community resources as well. But I certainly in remote northern communities, look, policing is so important in remote northern communities in a way that it has a different character and flavor than it does in the south. And if it's not properly funded, it destroys public trust in a whole range of justice institutions. It makes the communities less unsafe, and it makes vulnerable people less likely to go to the police for help.
Yeah, roughly 20 seconds left. I think we'll move on to Mr. Harris. Okay. Mr. Harris, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for your presentations. Let me start, first of all, with Mr. Wright. You didn't want to go into the machinations of carding in Nova Scotia, but you sort of touched on it. The CBC report today says that carding was made illegal, banned in Halifax, and street checks, rather, were banned in 2019. But you say that the provincial government seems to have tried a way around that. Has that presumably hasn't been successful, but clearly the evidence before the commission was that there was actually a disproportionately targeted for Black Nova Scotians in that situation. Do you think a national, and I think you did say a national ban of some sort might be effective in overriding that? Do you think that that's something that we should look further into?
I think that there is space for a national directive to the provinces that oversee policing to ensure that those jurisdictions that oversee policing are ensuring that police are not breaking the law as a regular part of their standard operating procedures. Street checks were declared through a legal opinion to have been an illegal practice. We believe that the current ministerial directive that governs how police should be stopping people is also directing them to do something that is illegal. And rather than the province seeking some kind of judicial authority or legislative authority to do that work, they simply are doing this thing. And all of the local systems to oversee police seem to have been powerless or feckless in their response to our concerns. So there does seem to be some space for some federal intervention.
I wonder out loud at this point whether or not the contract policing arrangements with the RCMP and the provinces might be able to deal with such an issue, but that's something we can look into a little later. I have a question for Mr. Cowan. Thank you for your presentation. There's a lot of talk, of course, about increasing the number of Inuit in the police force. I read a report, of course, last fall saying that we heard nice words from Commissioner Lucky as well about some training programs. But the fact of the matter seems to be that there hasn't been a single Inuit person recruited in Nunavut in the last 15 years. So is this a realistic idea, or is this just another current response to something that's been going on for decades and hasn't been fixed?
Thank you. It's a really interesting question. Look, I struggle to recruit. It's a big focus of what I try to do to recruit Inuit lawyers to come to work for my organization. And the first principle that in my experience is that Inuit and more broadly speaking, Indigenous people know which organizations are safe for them and know which organizations are invested in their success. And that is a fundamental conversation that I have when I'm recruiting with Inuit applicants in a way that is and Indigenous applications generally, and is front and center in my strategy and in their questions and in their in the conversation about how we're going to advance their career. And I think the lack of success in recruiting Inuit into the RCMP likely reflects, to a large part, their assessment of whether that organization is safe for them and whether it is invested truly in their success.
Well, one Inuit lawyer from Nunavut was on CBC recently, and she described the relationship between the Inuit and the RCMP is that the people feared them and didn't trust them. And maybe that has something to do with the failure to be willing to play a role in that. Is that something you could agree with?
Look, yes, and that I'd also say again, an organization that does not the control that the RCMP senior management has over conduct investigations is virtually absolute, and the fact that they've struggled at the top level to even acknowledge systemic racism suggests that they would struggle to identify code of conduct violations and prosecute them. And not even for the sake of punishment, but even just for the sake of remedial measures. And I can't imagine. Let me put it this way: I can't imagine that it would be very difficult for an Indigenous person, especially an Inuit person, going into an organization and that does not have a record of taking these issues seriously internally.
We're going to have to leave it there, Mr. Harris. With that, Mr. Morrison, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I want to thank the witnesses today. It's really important for us to have experts like yourselves to guide us and help us with your expertise in building some recommendations so that we can improve law enforcement and policing in Canada. My first question for Senator White. I brought this up with the commissioner a little while ago about the hiring and maybe divesting hiring to provinces and territories for RCMP rather than a centralized, basically hiring process for all of Canada. I wonder if you've, maybe in your time up north, if you've maybe thought of, wouldn't it be better off if the provinces and territories were the ones that were actually doing the hiring? I know they have staffing officers in every province, but wouldn't they be better?
Certainly in 2001, when we ran our Inuit recruiting pilot project, that's exactly the way we did that. We identified the barriers to hire for Inuit into the RCMP. We developed solutions past those barriers, which did not include reduction in qualifications, so raising people to the bar, like most of us have been mentored in our lives. So that's really the model we looked at. The challenge you will face if you hire specifically to Nunavut is that many of those officers, like most are people who join the RCMP, want the opportunity to move somewhere else in the country if they choose to. So you have to ensure that you at least have a set of standards that are met. Now, say though, those standards, as an example, a vision standard, Inuit have a higher than average level of myopia, which required, in our case, to have laser eye surgery for half of our applicants. Certainly, we would not have been able to do that in the South. And in fact, the RCMP at the time weren't extremely happy with me doing it in the North. So I think you have to look at those standards and decide which of those are barriers that can be overcome rather than barriers that stop recruiting.
Okay, and maybe also for a question for Mr. Wright and Mr. Cowan, if we have time. I noticed when I read, Mr. Wright, your resume, you talk about basically crime prevention versus crime reduction. You're talking about diverting youth away from criminal activity and steering them down the right side of the street versus getting them into crime, and then it's very difficult. And Mr. Wright, you mentioned that in your opening statement. I wonder if you can just briefly each comment. There's not much time left.
Yeah, Mr. Morrison's left you 15 seconds each.
I will say simply that we all know that preventing crime is a lot easier than addressing it post fact, and that helping people to keep from developing a life of crime is easier than rehabilitating a criminal.
Very briefly, the available resources for diversion in Nunavut are shocking and embarrassingly low compared to any other jurisdiction in the country. There are simply no practical options, and there's a great deal of reluctance. It is, I started criminal practice 20 years ago when diversion was not always available and often looked at suspiciously, and I would say that is still the approach in Nunavut.
Thank you. Mr. Morris. And Mr. Fergus, 3 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Algonquins. I would also like to congratulate all of you on your testimony today, because since I only have 3 minutes, I'll be brief.
En anglais, je m'excuse. I will not have an opportunity to ask everyone a question, but Mr. Wright and Mr. Cowan and Senator White, thank you very much for your testimony. Mr. Wright, you had mentioned the importance of having a critical race perspective, and that when you have a situation, you gave us an example that when people are being arrested, you'll see that Blacks, if you don't use a critical race perspective, you'll come to the wrong conclusions. I also appreciate what Mr. Cowan had said in terms of that people, Inuit and further field Indigenous people won't feel that our federal policing services is a safe place for them to make a career. Mr. Wright, would you find that Afro-Nova Scotians, African Nova Scotians rather, do they consider the RCMP or local police services safe places?
I would have to say no. And for the sake of brevity, I'd just say that if we take a look at the numbers of human rights complaints that are being made by people who come from African backgrounds, we would see that as an evidence that there are human resource and human rights complaints that are levied. I would say when you think about the North, even more powerfully, if you think about it, we're asking people who come from ethnic settler backgrounds to train in a colonial model of policing to deliver that service to an Indigenous community. And to ask an Indigenous person to train in a colonial form of policing to police their own communities is really to ask them to adopt an internal identity struggle before they even have their first day on the job.
So then, how do we crack this nut? How do we have an opportunity to try to? What would you recommend that measures that we should take to try to increase the importance so that our policing forces reflect the diversity of our communities, and especially those who seem to be most targeted by our policing forces?
Yeah. Well, I think that particularly in Indigenous communities, probably what we need are Indigenous people creating Indigenous forms of public safety and policing, and perhaps even looking at Indigenous forms of understanding the law and public safety. Similarly, in Black communities, I've said we need an African Nova Scotian policing strategy here, something that is designed and run by Black folk.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Wright. And there's a principle of committees that we can't report unless we hear something from our witnesses or read something from our witnesses. So if there's anything that you feel that should be added, I encourage all our witnesses, please, to submit them to the clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Fergus. Mr. Vidal, 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank all of the witnesses again, as many of the members have indicated. My first question is for Senator White. Senator White, in your vast experience, I just want to draw on that a little bit. There's recently an article in the Canadian press detailing the work of the Anishinaabe ASCII Police Services and the success that they've had in doing culturally responsive training. In the article, it discusses the impact that the relationship between the police service and the community has on a level of trust, and that portrayal contrasts with the barriers that we see. And I've seen this in northern Saskatchewan, where the RCMP sends new recruits to places with significant language and culture barriers. You spoke about the 2-year aspect of going to these northern communities, but we also have this policy, it seems, where we send new and young members to these communities to gain experience, so to speak. I'm just curious of your opinion on what this policy says to these inexperienced members, these young recruits, and what that role or what role that plays in the lack of the opportunity to build good relationship in the communities like you talked about early on in your presentation.
Thank you very much for the question, sir. Certainly 15 or 20 years ago, the RCMP would not have allowed you to transfer, or seldom would have allowed you to transfer to the isolated northern communities in the 3 northern territories. But at that time, we had hundreds, if not more, applicants looking for transfers north who already had a substantial amount of experience. That's not true today. And the challenge I think they're facing in the RCMP is that they are probably thousands of officers short already. They do not have enough officers to even fill the positions they have across the country. And on top of that, have much lower number of officers applying to go into the isolated posts in the Northern Territories, for example. So as a result, they're having to send people with less experience than they would have in the past. That is a problem. I don't know if it's one that's solved easily beyond getting the RCMP numbers up to the level they should be, and then trying to see whether or not you could recruit. And I would argue the same for Northern Saskatchewan from those First Nation, Inuit, Métis communities to go back into those communities. And I'm not suggesting, as many Inuit would not necessarily want to work in the community they grew up in, for example, but nothing stops them from working in another community, for example, on a different part of Baffin Island. So I'm always back to the same thing, that if we cannot represent those we serve, we're not representing those we serve. As I would argue in the past, recruiting with a window, not a mirror. If we can't get to that point, we're probably not going to be successful in, as I think Mr. Fergus said, cracking this nut.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vidal. Madame Damoff, 3 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, I believe I'll be taking over Ms. Damoff's spot, if that's
right. Okay. Mr. Randan Sangari.
Thank you. And then I want to thank the witnesses as well. Mr. Cowan, I want to talk to you about the issue of accountability, civilian oversight. I know you had mentioned the challenges that you've had, and the fact that you've taken you've made some complaints through the system. What has your experience been in representing clients, and the outcome, the timelines, the transparency, and the actual accountability measures that have come out from these complaints?
With respect to the CRCC particular, or just generally with respect to the RCMP?
If you can speak to both, I think it'll be helpful.
So look, our experience with the CRCC is that it is, I've no doubt that it is a well-meaning organization, but it has a limited mandate, and it has a critical funding problem, which is, I'd also say, look, that there are no, as far as I am aware, there are not any Indigenous or Northern commissioners on the commission, and I would suggest that is a immediate and quick fix that could be made. But ultimately, it's an organization with a very limited mandate, and I feel somewhat uncomfortable sort of picking on it, because it can only do what it can do.
Mr. Cowan, because of limited time, is there a model that you think can work for the RCMP? Is there a model out there that you could, you would think can be modified to help the RCMP with this?
I think if you look at just about every province, and indeed on the CRCC's website, they show the different oversight models for different provinces, and you need a combination of civilian investigation of criminal matters and complaint-based independent investigation of conduct matters.
And how about systemic issues? So I know the individual complaints will lead to individual results, how about systemic issues? How do we address that?
With systemic issues, again, what you want is a mandate to do systemic reviews on the part of usually the same organization does the conduct investigations. But again, I would also look at the use of a civilian board providing direct oversight over the RCMP to hold them accountable on their policy and strategy decisions.
Thank you. And Mr. Wright, can you weigh into this as well, please?
Very briefly, please.
Very briefly, I would say that such groups often will have equity and diversity kinds of profiles or subcommittees, and I find those kinds of generic equity committees to be very unsatisfactory. And perhaps what is necessary is very culturally or community-specific committees to help inform those bodies.
Thank you, Mr. Anans-Angry. Madame Michaud, a minute and a half, please.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Wright, I'll put my question to you. Given your experience of social work out in the field, in light of this experience, can you expect to us the impact of systemic racism in police services, impact on racialized, Indigenous, and youth?
The impact, the overrepresentation of racialized people as having contact with the police. I think it was Mr. Cohen who just said the litany. We're over-policed, we're overcharged, we're over-prosecuted, we are disproportionately found guilty, higher sentences, differential and negative experiences while under correctional supervision, serve our sentences longer, have a harder time transitioning into community and receiving education and employment thereafter. I think that that's the effect that systemic racism tends to have on racialized people in Canada as it comes to policing and contact with the criminal justice system.
Merci, Madame Michaud. Mr. Harris, a minute and a half.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question for Mr. Cowan related to the CRCC. I understand your organization has put before the CRCC 2 letters of complaint in recent times related to the conduct of RCMP in handling of prisoners, particularly women prisoners. Could you outline those complaints to the committee and reflect on whether or not this has any bearing on our study of systemic racism as it relates to policing in the northwest in Nunavut?
Okay, I don't think I don't think we have the time for me to recount in any detail, but I will ensure I'll make sure that the committee has a copy of my letter that outlines my 2 letters that outline various issues with respect to it. Look, I should also say that with respect to the issue of the strip searching that took place in December, there were a handful of cases that I raised with the Commission. I also raised them directly with the senior officer of the RCMP in Iqaluit to try and in good faith to say, look, this is happening. What is your organization going to do about it? And I was very disappointed in her approach, which was to say, well, until we have individual complainants come forward, we can't do anything. It's not true. And it shows, I think, the fundamental lack of engagement and commitment to change and accountability on the part of the senior management. But I will send the letter in the correspondence I provided so that the committee has the benefit of that.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Unfortunately, that brings this panel to a close, and I want on behalf of the committee say these are very thoughtful comments on all of your parts, and will be very informative to our study going forward. Colleagues, at this point we adjourn.